Hello everybody and welcome to this video. Mr. Johnson teaches Storm on the Island revision. This is part of your GCSE English Literature and this is paper 2, section B. And this is where you will be given a question by the exam board about one of the 15 poems from the Power and Conflict cluster, and then it is up to you to compare it with a second poem of your choice which isn't printed there in front of you. So it could well be that Storm on the Island is the one that they name with a question, or it could well be that the question that they give you compares really well with Storm on the Island. Either way, you're going to want to know it. It's definitely one of those poems which compares really well with lots of the others. So let's get going. Before that, just make sure that you have got a pen and paper ready because you need to be actively revising during this video, not just watching and listening me blather on. You want to make some notes because it could well be that something that's said here is something that comes up. So without further ado, let's move on to the first thing, which is making sure you've got a copy of the poem in front of you for this revision session. It's going to be really important. It may be you need to get one off of the internet if you don't have your anthology at home with you. You can find it quite easily simply by searching for Storm on the Island Heaney, which is the poet's surname, Seamus Heaney. Either way, pause this video if you haven't got that ready, and when you have, press play and we'll get going. With the fact that I'd like you to pause this video one more time just to read the poem to yourself. It's a fairly short one, so it shouldn't take you too long. But either way, before we get any further with this revision, it's really important you know that poem in your head, because I'm going to be assuming that you've got it fresh in your head. So pause this video one more time, please, and just read that poem carefully to yourself. And once you've done that, hopefully you had a highlighter with you while you're doing that. Always good to highlight poems as you're rereading them. Anything which leaps out at you. So let's move on then. Let's talk a little bit about Seamus Heaney. Be prepared to make some notes somewhere about him. Born in Northern Ireland, 1939. Died a few years ago now in 2013. The fact that his father was a farmer really affected Heaney's poetry. He grew up on a farm, therefore he knew the countryside, he knows farm life, and you can certainly see that sort of filtering its way into his poetry. So that's something that's worth knowing about. I mean, Storm on the Island contains lots of references to nature. If you're working on a farm, you're outdoors all the time, you are going to be experiencing the weather and sort of know it well. So that could be an influence in his poetry, certainly. And like it says at the bottom bullet point, our relationship with nature comes up, and also our vulnerability. The fact that we are certainly... nature has an impact on us a lot of the time, even though we sometimes feel quite safe from it when we're in our houses and in our classrooms. Actually, nature still plays a really destructive force in our lives quite frequently. Think about the flooding that's happened in recent years around the country, for example. So there you go. Making notes on Seamus Heaney. Those are some key things that you definitely would like to know. And it's all about whether you can try and just sort of feed those sorts of ideas alongside your answers. You do not need to give a life history of the poet when you're writing your answers at GCSE. Often though, the stronger students and the stronger answers will manage to drop and feed some of this into their answers with what they've been saying. Anyway, moving on, the context is really important to this poem as well. I'm not going to read through all of that now to you. You're able to pause this and make those notes yourself, but it's really key to know that a lot of his works of poetry were written during what were called the Troubles. It was in Northern Ireland when we had sort of fighting going on between different religious groups, Protestants and Catholics, and it went on from the 1960s right through till 1998. And while there are still problems and still skirmishes and incidents go on, it's nothing like it was, and lots of students just don't realise just how much violence there was in our country. We're talking about Northern Ireland being part of Great Britain. So I'm not going to read through exactly the details of that, but take away the fact there were lots of violence, there were bombs being set off, people being murdered. It was very, very violent, and also British troops were sent in to try and keep peace and try and help the situation, but in many ways often things became worse with the British Army there as well. So there we go. That is the context of Storm on the Island. Again, read through that properly in your own time, make some extra notes. The title of the poem. Always look at titles. Titles matter. The fact that the first 8 letters of the poem spell Stormont, which is the name of the Parliament buildings in Belfast for Northern Ireland, perhaps sort of adding an extended metaphor, just trying to make a link for you, the fact that this isn't quite simply just a poem about a storm on an island, which is one way you could absolutely read it in a very straightforward way. You could say, this is a poem about a storm on the island. If you're able to see how actually the storm and sort of all that trouble could be a metaphor for the troubles which happened in Northern Ireland, then you're starting to get a deeper understanding of this poem. So either way, the fact that that happens in the title, I think is really important. And then just look at the poem as a whole there. Before you read through it in detail, look at it and you'll see that there are no stanzas going on there. Look down the right hand side and you'll see that there is no rhyme going on there either. So yeah, there's lots of enjambment. While some of the early lines there's a comma and a full stop, actually huge numbers of those lines are spilling over into each other. So the fact there are no stanzas and no rhyme and lots of enjambment means that there's no real organisation. It's quite chaotic. And you could say that how the structure of this poem mirrors the chaos of the storm and maybe even mirrors the chaos of the troubles going on in Northern Ireland during that time as well. So actually, in many ways, the structure is metaphorical and sort of represents and reflects the storm. So I'm going to read through bits by bits. I've tried to divide it as best as I could into key groups of lines. I won't have time to talk about everything, but I will try and point out some of the key things that appear in this poem, and maybe some of the key methods as well. Be ready to pause and annotate your copy of the poem or write down some notes. So it starts with, we are prepared, and it instantly makes us wonder who we are exactly, but it almost gets instantly ready for something bad coming, doesn't it? We are prepared. We build our houses squat, low to the ground, like you see in that picture behind it. Sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. There's lots of very robust and strong imagery there of sort of bracing yourself, getting low to the ground like you're getting ready for an attack from something. This wizened earth has never troubled us with hay, so as you see there are no stacks or stooks that can be lost. So they're in a harsh environment. The fact that the earth has never given them hay, they are unable to grow some of those sort of really basic crops, which means there are no haystacks and hay stooks. They're there. And then it goes on to say there's caesura a lot here as well, those pauses in the middle of lines, sort of quite uncomfortable. We don't really feel comfortable pausing in the middle of lines because it feels like it should be running to the end. It then moves on to say, nor are there trees, which is something you get on sort of really exposed places. Places in Cornwall, there are lots of those where there are no trees around the coastline. It's sort of too hard for the trees to grow. Nor are there trees, which might prove company when it blows full blast. You know what I mean. So there's a bit of direct address, almost making us feel involved in this poem in some way. You know what I mean. Leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale. So we've got almost, I would call that personification. You've got this idea like a chorus, a singing, often positive imagery, but in some ways that's sort of contrasted here in the sense of we're talking about a storm and the noise of a storm. Try and picture where you've heard wind rushing through trees and it makes that deep roaring sound. He calls it a tragic chorus. In some ways you could almost argue that's an oxymoron going on there as well. Chorus, positive, tragic, negative. So those two contrasting words put together. So that you listen to the thing you fear, forgetting that it pummels your house too. There are lots of words which create imagery in this poem to do with like violence and action. So pummels is a very good example of that. To pummel is almost to hit again and again and again. So the storm is pummeling your house too. But there are no trees, no natural shelter. Look at that repetition of no, no, almost trying to really serve as a reminder to us that this is a harsh environment that they are trying to live in, and the storm is like a harsh force that is attacking their houses. So also like lots of natural imagery as well. We're focusing on shelter, trees, gales, leaves, branches. There's lots of, like I say, lots of links with nature in this poem. And then we move on to the final part of the poem. You might think, there it is again, you might think that the sea is company. And here's another oxymoron for you. Exploding comfortably. How can something explode comfortably? Ask yourself that. Yet the fact that they've chosen the word comfortable almost suggests that they are used to this experience of being battered by storms. They're used to these harsh conditions that they're living in. So the sea is exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. But no. When it begins, the flung spray, so like that spray you see in the image behind it there, spray hits your very windows, spits like a tame cat turned savage. It's a fantastic simile, that one, and a really memorable line for when it comes to trying to talk about this poem. And if you don't have it in front of you, imagine that spits, there's that verb, spits like a tame cat, something which is normally very peaceful, like the sea. It's tame, but then it's turned savage. So again, juxtaposition going on within that simile as well. We just sit tight while the wind dives and strafes invisibly. Those are war words, particularly to do with like bullets that fly through the air. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded. That's another great verb, linking to the one we had earlier, like pummeled, another violent verb. Bombarded with the empty air. And that's almost a strange mixed imagery going on there. How can you be bombarded by something invisible? And then that final line almost captures what I've said there. Strange, it is a huge nothing that we fear. Almost maybe implying that it's their psychological fears rather than something physical. It's something very much not there. Anyway, there are lots and lots more things you could say about that, but hopefully those are some of the key ideas that you could draw out of Storm on the Island. That word bombard is sort of the imagery I wanted to capture there with that image, really. Again, it links to very much like war imagery. There is a lot of war imagery through this. As I said, strafes, salvo are all words we associate with war. And also the idea that this imagery of just sort of the wind and nature being a real force here, this sort of huge nothing that we fear, and like the idea of it being invisible. So these questions I would like you to have a go at using to help your annotations a little bit, and actually try answering them as well, because they're sort of going to guide your thinking here a little bit. Like the first one, yes, there's enjambment, but ask yourself, what is the effect of having those lines spill into each other? The fact that nature, and I've put a capital N on there deliberately, number 2, nature is personified. By giving it a capital letter there, you're almost implying that it's a physical, a living presence. And lots of the poets do describe nature in that sense. So there's some questions to guide you. With a final thought about comparisons with other poems, well, we're talking nature poems here, definitely. So with that idea in mind, certainly Extract from the Prelude with the stealing of the boat would be a very good one. I mean, Tissue contains lots of imagery which is very soft, so in some ways that compares well with this one because this imagery is much more violent, perhaps. Those two very good examples. The Emigre, perhaps, contains some very soft imagery compared to the violent imagery you see here. So in many ways, having different poems which talk about nature, so the thing they both all have in common is they're all about nature, but lots of others do it in a very soft and delicate way, whereas this one is much harsher. Perhaps Ozymandias as well, in the sense of nature being a very powerful force, with time being a very powerful force there, whereas this is the weather that's a very powerful force. There's a question to have a consideration of. How does Heaney explore the power of nature? So pause it, have a go at that question once you've had a look at my next slide, which has an example for you. It's a PEAR paragraph structure. The enjambment is something I would say focus on next. Look at the structure and how that feels out of control when you do your paragraph, and try and write about what that mirrors, like the fact the structure is out of control mirrors the fact that, and try and see if you can fill that gap. And with that all said, there they are. So the blue is my point. It contains the method that I've named there as well, which is the simile. So I've chosen to focus on that spits like a tame cat turned savage, which I've embedded as a quote on my green example for you there. So I've got my first sentence pretty much answers the question directly about what is happening in the poem and the power of nature. Then I've picked out a method. There's my evidence. The red bit is my analysis. I've really tried to unpick the words from the quote I've chosen, like savage, and talked about its connotations. As you read it, notice that I've talked about sort of what those words make us think of. And finally, and almost most importantly for you there at the bottom, the purple bit is the writer's message. What are they trying to teach us? What are they trying to show us through this poem? So use the sentence starters I've put there, like it teaches us this, we feel this. And those sorts of sentences will guide you towards a really strong answer. So there you go, my video on Storm on the Island for you. Well worth rewatching and pausing and going back through to really help you get an understanding of these poems. Above all, keep calm. Poetry is in the exams so that you can show that you have thoughts inside your head and can understand somebody else's thoughts and feelings, and that's done through this poem. So I'm going to say thank you very much for watching this video, and good luck when it comes to your exams. Bye bye.